Hey guys, today we're going to talk about races characters can play in Dungeons & Dragons. Now in the old days, when this game first started, all the non-human and part-human races closely resemble humans in many aspects. It is assumed that similarities are sufficiently apparent so as to warrant no further comment, and only special racial characteristics which are dissimilar to humans will be dealt with. Characters differ slightly within their respective races as a whole. Now we're going to start with dwarves. The race of dwarves typically dwells in hilly or mountainous regions. As player characters, both dwarves and their cousins, the mountain dwarves, can be considered. A character of the dwarven race can be a fighter, a thief, or an assassin. It is also possible for a dwarven character to opt to work simultaneously in the fighter and thief classes. In the latter event, the dwarf will be limited to the armor permitted a thief when performing any functions of that class. Experience will always be divided between the two classes also, even though the dwarf may no longer advance upwards in fighting ability level. Because of their very nature, dwarves are non-magical and do not ever use magical spells. However, this nature gives them a bonus with regard to their saving throws against attacks by magic wands, staves, rods, and spells. This bonus is +1 for every 3.5 points of constitution ability. Thus, if a dwarf had a constitution of 7, he or she would gain a +2 on die rolls made as saving throws. At 14 constitution, the bonus would be +4, and at 18 constitution, the bonus would be the maximum normally possible, +5. Similarly, dwarves have exceptional constitutional strength with regard to toxic substances, ingested or injected. Therefore, all dwarven characters make saving throws against poison in the same manner and with the same bonuses as they do against magical attacks from wands, staves, rods, and spells. All dwarves are able to speak the following languages: Dwarven, Gnome, Goblin, Kobold, and Orcish. In addition, dwarven characters are able to speak the common tongue of all humankind. However, except for their alignment language, they are unable to learn more than 2 additional languages regardless of their intelligence ability. Dwarves are able to see radiation in the infrared spectrum, so they can see up to 60 feet in the dark and noting varying degrees of heat radiation. This ability is known as infravision. Dwarves are miners of great skill. They are able to detect the following facts when within 10 feet or less of the particular phenomenon. They can detect grades or slopes in a passage at 75% probability. They can detect new construction of a passage or a tunnel at 75% probability. They can detect sliding or shifting walls and or rooms at 66 2/3% probability, and detect traps involving pits, falling blocks, and other stonework at 50% probability. And lastly, determine approximate depth underground with 50% probability. Note that the dwarven character must be actively seeking to determine the phenomenon in question in order to be able to determine the answer. The information does not simply spring to mind unbidden. In melee combat, dwarves add 1 to their dice rolls to hit opponents who are half-orcs, goblins, hobgoblins, or orcs. When being attacked by ogres, trolls, ogre magi, giants, and or titans, dwarves subtract 4 from their opponents to hit dice rolls because of the dwarves' small size and combat ability against these much bigger creatures. As has already been noted, dwarven characters get a bonus of 1 added to their initial constitution ability and a penalty of 1 on their charisma score due to racial characteristics. It is very important to note that the actual charisma score prior to racial adjustment, however, for dwarven characters do not suffer charisma penalties, nor are they limited to a 16 charisma maximum with regard to their own race. For example, let us suppose a player who has rolled a charisma score of 18 decides to have a dwarven character, thus reducing charisma score by 1 due to the racial characteristics. However, the highest possible score for a dwarf is 16, so the character's charisma score is recorded as 16. With regard to non-dwarven henchmen, the character is limited to a maximum of 8, but with regard to dwarves, the character has a score of 18 charisma, so up to 15 henchmen would serve the character, and the additional servitors over and above 8 were themselves dwarves. In Teutonic and especially Scandinavian mythology and folklore, the term dwarf denoted a species of fairy inhabiting the interiors of mountains and the lower levels of mines. Dwarves were of various types, all of small stature, some being no more than 18 inches high, and others about the height of a 2-year-old child. In appearance, they were sometimes beautiful, but more usually they resembled grave old men with long beards and in some cases humped backs. The mountain dwarves were organized in kingdoms or tribes with their own kings, chieftains, and armies. They lived in subterranean halls believed to be full of gold and precious stones. They were principally famous for their skill in all kinds of metalwork and the forging of magical swords and rings, but they were also credited with profound wisdom and secret knowledge, having power to foresee the future, assume other forms, and make themselves invisible. Many legends show dwarves as kindly beings, generous to those who please them, but vengeful when offended. The Swiss dwarves, or earthmen, sometimes helped in agricultural work, found straying animals, and put out firewood or fruit for poor children to find. In Scandinavia and Germany, also they were friendly to men, but occasionally they stole corn, teased cattle, and abducted children and young girls. Services rendered to them were often repaid by gifts of gold from their hoards, but those who stole their treasures either met with great misfortune thereafter, or found the gold turned to dead leaves when they reached home. Mine-dwelling dwarves were usually more capricious and spiteful than their mountain brothers. They could be heard moving around the lower levels and were sometimes seen by miners, who took care to placate them by gifts of food.